Big ideas start with a spark. At Tassis, we use that spark to ignite the fire in ourselves and our kids. So with the trust we build and the knowledge we share, we can grow together and stand tall, creating opportunities to advance in business while setting an example for the next generation. Whether you are starting fresh in Portugal or expanding globally, we're here to support each other. This is more than a network. We are a community that sets the examples for the leaders of tomorrow. Join Tassis Paris business community and share your knowledge and insights. Scan the QR for more information. See you there.
Henrique is a partner in the real estate group at a law firm called Antes de Cunha. Their formal name's a bunch of letters. You can see it in the website. But just for context, when I first got to Portugal and I was looking to start a fund, it took me over 2 weeks just to get access to somebody with this level of experience. A lot of calls, a lot of introductions, because usually you're going to speak with a lot more junior people. Henrique, maybe you can tell us a little bit about your background and just a little bit about the firm to get started.
Hello, everybody. Good morning. I'll try not to be very boring. This is a very, it's just the matters I'm going to talk about. They're not very attractive, not very sexy, but I'll do my best. Thank you for having me.
Our pleasure.
Well, I've been in the real estate market working as a lawyer for 30 years. I work real estate projects, company law and taxation. I think that these three areas are linked. So when we work on one area, we also need to work on the other. So I would say that this is what really matters in this sector. My law firm, we have offices in Lisbon, Porto and Braga. We are almost 200 people. We have grown a lot in the past years. We have offices in Spain and all over South America as well, because we have a connection with a Spanish firm called Zeller. And that's it.
Yeah, we've got family and friends who've used the law firm before, and all give us great feedback. So
thank you.
We appreciate you being here. So Henrique said this is boring. It's not boring to me, obviously. As you guys know, I do a lot of work in the finance and legal area to try to understand, and hopefully we can all educate each other. So I think this is going to be another educational session. Can you please tell us about the different ways or the different structures, legal steps of how one can purchase property or develop real estate in Portugal?
If you're buying your own property and you're getting a loan, it's your first home or second home, you can do it on an individual level, and that's quite straightforward and quite simple. If you're talking about the development in the project that you want to develop and, make money and sell it to a third party, I would advise setting up a very simple structure. We call them limitada. It's a limited liability company, minimum share capital, just one shareholder. And then what you can do, you can take it from there. You can grow the company, and at some point you can even transform that company into a fund. We have that, someone before me talked about it, we can come to that. So I always say that the best way to start is a very, very simple way. Let's not complicate, let's not get a very complex structure and go step by step. And go step by step when you want to set up a structure. So the first one would be a very simple limited company. You don't need to have an auditor, it's just one director. Any foreigner can hold shares in Portuguese companies, can be a director of a company, and that's an important thing. Another thing, we should not use offshore structures in Portugal because they are not tax attractive. There is a penalty or an additional tax when using offshore companies. So I would put the offshore structures aside and use European structures to develop the project.
And when we talk about offshore, I think that's an important point. Even if the owner of the company is an offshore entity.
Even if the ultimate beneficial owner is an offshore company, it creates an additional taxation on capital gains, on IMT, on the acquisition of the property, and on the IMI, which is the annual tax you have to pay. And that's one of the problems, this is not the forum, but that's one of the problems the Novo Banco is having in Portugal, because their real estate is paying 7.5% on IMI over the properties. And that's something that it's under discussion in courts, because the ultimate beneficial owner of the bank is located in an offshore jurisdiction.
So that's very important as expats to understand the nationality and where you have business throughout the world, because even part of your business.
We have a blacklist. We call it the blacklist. with the details of each blacklisted jurisdiction.
Which, for reference, is bigger than the blacklist for most of Europe.
Yes,
correct?
It's very large, yes.
So you talked about setting up a simple company, but there are other types of companies. So as you go into bigger, right? And you mentioned about the needs for oversight, like accounting. Maybe just talk about the difference between a limitada and then sort of the next level in the...
Well, the other one, it's the stock company. We call them Sociedade Anónima. They're not so used nowadays because we used to have bearer shares. Now we don't have them anymore. So the name of the owner of the shares is not public in the sense that you have access on the company's registration of the excerpt. Unlike the Sociedades por Cotas, the limited liability companies. It is mandatory to have an auditor, the certified chartered accountant. The amount of the share capital is different. It's higher if you have a stock company. But apart from that, the way you operate on a daily basis, it's pretty much the same.
Right.
That's why people are not using the stock companies so often as we used to.
It has a higher overhead cost. Like one of the things that we learned in our conversation.
Yeah, but it's not that much. It's not that much. Once you get to a certain level, it's not that much.
Even a limitada needs to have an accountant
just the
books.
Just the accountant, yes.
But when you get to the difference between an accountant and the other is it's actual registered. It's like having a CPA firm doing an audit from a U.S. perspective.
Exactly.
And another thing that I learned in our conversation was how similar in distributing the gains a limitada is to, say, a U.S. LLC, that you can actually define in the operating agreement. And in other words, you may own 50% of the company, but you may take a bigger share. And this is things that allows you to do a promote. Maybe you can just explain that a little bit more and how that works.
How it works. Typically, in the arrangements for the development of the project, you have agreements between shareholders. Someone talked about it before me. So you have the local partners being the developers or the initial promoters of the project. And then you have the partners or silent partners that are bringing equity into the projects. If you have a stock company, you can have different levels of shares, different categories of shares. So typical class A, B, C, and then you can attribute different rights, not just to voting, but also to dividends and priority in dividends to the holders of each category of shares. When it comes to the other companies, the Sociedades por Cotas, the limitada, it's something you don't have. But you can have it in the bylaws and you can have it in the shareholders' agreement, whereby the general meeting will agree to make a non-proportional distribution of dividends. So it's up to the parties to decide exactly how to distribute the dividends, and it can be, even if I have 10%, I can get 50%. So it's really up to the shareholders to decide.
And so that would be the preferable structure for most developers if they don't have a complex capital structure.
Agreed.
So they can have a very clear definition.
Which can be changed at any time.
And it can be changed as you go.
Exactly.
So we talked about the structure that you set up for your own company, but also when you're acquiring a piece of land or property, it's also important to understand the structure that the property is set up in and what are you actually buying. Maybe you can talk a little bit about the difference of actually buying the asset versus buying the stock and the importance of understanding that distinction.
Asset deal as opposed to share deal. When it comes to a share deal, which is very common in Portugal because people tend to buy a property and a few years later they sell it because they did not develop or because the property was in the family for some reasons. We have a lot of transactions which take place via the transfer of the shares. The most important thing would be to analyze the book value of the property, and many people don't do it. And when it comes to future sales, if, for example, we pay 100 for the shares and the book value is 50, when it comes to future capital gains, it will be the starting point will be 50, not 100, which was the price we paid for the shares. So, and that sometimes creates a problem, not just an accounting problem, but obviously a tax problem for the developer. So I would say that's one of the most important things to do, is starting by that. The second thing, and I think it was Pedro who mentioned it before me, it's the licensing. It is really a nightmare. The architects deal with it, the lawyers deal with it, but it's a nightmare because it's never what's in the documents. It's always something different. So as well, the other gentleman before me, he said, I don't remember his name, I didn't get it. Go to the city hall, discuss it with people, talk to everybody, and make sure that what you're buying is exactly what you're buying, and don't trust just the papers. Get into the detail of the licenses, because it can jeopardize the whole investment, as we all know.
So getting back to your first point, I think if I understood it right, it's very common in Portugal for people to own real estate in companies, and then when they sell it, a lot of times they prefer to sell it, the stock in the company, versus selling the real estate. So when you see a property or something you're investigating, very early in the process, you want to understand what you're buying. And for me, coming from the outside, that was not as typical as I was used to, except in very large transactions. But here in Portugal, it can happen at all levels.
The taxation can be lower for the seller.
Right.
And then most of the times the purchaser is attracted because someone tells them, oh, you don't pay the transfer taxes, the IMT and the stamp duty, which is correct. But the capital gains, it's much higher than the IMT. So you save in the early stages of the development, but at the end you'll have a problem. So typically you get together with a seller and see what are you getting, what is the buyer getting, and try to mix it and see the advantages and try to split the advantage in the negotiation.
The seller is basically trying to pass the capital gains onto the buyer.
The future capital gains, yes. So there's a tax contingency there.
Right. So as you say, doing the diligence ahead of time is important. Another thing that you mentioned was understanding the VAT regime that the asset that you're purchasing is under. Maybe just talk a little bit about the two different regimes and the key things to understand.
When we're talking about the refurbishment activity of the real estate, if we're talking about a property that is located in a certain area, which is called ARU, an area for rehabilitation of the property, which is approved by each municipality, you can have the possibility of paying 6% VAT as opposed to 23%. So it's a 17% difference, which of course it's a huge difference, and ultimately in the pocket of the developer. It's not simple. It is true that it is 6%. But there's a lot of people trying to sell property saying that although it's going to be a new construction, it's located in an ARU area and it's subject to 6%, which is not entirely correct. In some situations it may be correct, but in most of them it's not. So I'm talking for residential purposes. So this is something that one needs to be aware of because the difference is quite significant. If it's not residential, it is possible to deduct the VAT if the end client will pay VAT. So if I'm developing a hotel, for example, given that the client will pay VAT on the room, the developer will get to deduct the VAT on the construction. So that's a different regime.
That's as long as they own it for long enough. Like, because a lot of people think about VAT that I can end up deducting it from my revenue, right? So if you're doing a tourism development, you're saying that if I own it for long enough, I can deduct that VAT over the operational VAT.
I think it's 20 years. If you sell it before the 20 years, you need to pay the pro rata.
Right.
I'm not 100% sure, but I think it's 20 years.
But on residential or smaller...
on residential, you can't.
It is a real cost that people need to think about.
Unless you develop an Airbnb activity and the client pays VAT. But that's another thing. But it would work.
Right. So it can be a considerable impact on the return of the project.
Very significant.
Especially if you think it's 6 and it turns out to be 23%.
Turns out to be 23, exactly.
So on that note, I think it's also, there's clearly a lot of diligence that needs to be done. And a lot of times people find it what they think is a great deal, but they're afraid to lose it and maybe enter into contract sooner. Can you talk a little bit about a potential structure or agreements that can be put in place that gets you some exclusivity, but before you enter into the CPCV?
Right. A quite classic way of doing it would be to sign a term
in English, I
a
think
term sheet,
LOI,
or letter of intent, a term sheet between the parties. And the idea is to have a minimum, let's say, 60, 90-day exclusivity period, not just to analyze the project and the due diligence and everything, but to put the investors together, to prepare and structure everything. And during that period, the only thing that we have is exclusivity when you're doing it. So we can somehow summarize the key aspects of the future transaction. And in some situations, there is the payment of what we call the earnest money, just to show the good intention of the potential purchaser. And that earnest money, if the transaction is not concluded, usually it's returned to the investor. Following, we do in Portugal, it's very common to do the CPCV. We have this regime of the deposit amount that it's very in our culture. We know that when you sign a CPCV, we lose the deposit if we breach the contract, and the other way around, the other party needs to reimburse the deposit plus the same amount as penalty. But the foreigners are not very familiar with this. So in some other transactions, we do an SPA with a signing date, subject to some conditions precedent that need to be met up until closing. The structure can be more or less the same, so SPA, signing, and then closing of the transaction.
From my perspective, this is why it's really important to have good legal counsel. You know, a lot of times the real estate agents, both yours and the seller, are trying to push to get a CPCV in place and get the deposit done, so you sort of lock in the transaction. You know, I just recently learned about the possibility of having a term sheet or an LOI that actually can get you exclusivity for a period of time. And I think having a good counsel helps you negotiate that with their counsel and explain those terms.
And in large projects, this is quite common.
Right.
If you're buying a house, it doesn't work like this. But in a large development, this is quite common.
And it can also be used for a development where you're buying land to research the land and have time to talk to the camera, et cetera, before you enter into a contract.
Correct.
Just thinking about the tax planning aspect, we've talked about the different structures. Earlier in the conversation, gentlemen talked about SIC or a fund. Maybe just talk a little bit about the tax advantages of that and the path that a company can take, even if they don't do it right from the beginning, before there's an exit, how you can take advantage of that.
We can develop a large project during the construction phase, CPCV. I'm talking about, let's say, residential project, and at the end I want to sell the units to the final clients. We can develop the project along the way using a simple structure, and at some point, before the profit starts kicking in, we can transform the company from a regular SPV into a SIC. A SIC, it's a structure that works like a fund. We can have it transformed. And what the tax authority says that my taxation will be according to the legal structure I have in place on the 31st of December. So if I transform the company in the year that I will start signing the notarial deeds, the escrituras, I can benefit from the tax regime
since the beginning of the year.
Since the beginning of the year. So having said this, the big advantage is these structures, they do not pay the corporate income tax, which is quite significant. So corporate income...
Typically in the 28...
Well, the basis is 20%, but then we have some brackets. If it exceeds a certain profit, it can go a little bit higher. So it
avoids double taxation from that perspective.
And then if you want to distribute on the exit, it's not mandatory to distribute, but if you decide to distribute the proceeds, we can structure it in a way that it will pay 10% to non-foreigners or to foreign companies. If it's to locals, it's 25, 28, but typically we structure it with foreign companies holding the shares. The transformation, we need to transform the company to a stock company, and the share capital will be divided, split in shares. The downside of all this, if you don't have the internal structure to manage the company yourself, we call it the self-management companies, you need to hire the services of a professional company. This is a regulator activity, so it's not by saying I will manage my own company. It doesn't work like that. So you have to go through a process with the Securities Exchange Commission. So at the beginning, people go and hire the services of a professional management company, which has costs. And there will be an annual fee based on the assets under management. So that needs to be taken into consideration. So this structure makes sense when you have a large project. And then there's always another thing that the investors don't like, and I understand it. The investors, they lose the control over the asset because they don't have the signing power. The signing power over the documents, over the bank accounts and everything is transferred to the management company. So you need to trust the management company. You can replace it, of course, but you need to trust them. And at some point you will feel, well, if I want to sign this document or this bank or make this payment, I can't do it. I need to explain it to the management company. It's up to them to do it. There are ways that they always sell you this, oh, I will have an agreement, a services agreement, I'll give you a power of attorney for this and that. But at the end of the day, it's not like that.
And part of the reason is because there's a fiduciary duty, right?
There is a fiduciary, and it's their liability. At the end of the day, they are liable for what they do. So they have to be careful with what they are signing.
So what you're saying is there's really a couple of ways to set up a SIC or a fund structure, even if it's a captive fund in just your own investment. One is you can be self-managed, but there's a higher hurdle. Potentially you have to put up more capital at risk.
Not just more capital, because the share capital, exactly, it's a little bit higher. It's 300,000 as opposed to 50,000. But I would say that on this level, that is not significant. The thing is...
But you also keep the fiduciary liability as the fund owner.
You do.
The other option is to hire an outside management company for oversight.
But to do it yourself, you need to have the expertise and the people in your company to go through a process, like an acceptance process,
by
like
the
a
SEC,
due diligence, by the SEC. And you need to have the
professional background.
The professional background of managing these sort of companies.
So the bottom line is these funds, to the end investor, could have almost a 40%, with the corporate savings and then the individual savings for a foreign investor, it could almost have a 40% savings in tax. But there is an additional overhead cost and process you have to go through.
That is all correct. And on top of that, if the purpose of the vehicle is not to distribute immediately the proceeds of the activity, and if you reinvest, let's say that you have a structure, the purpose is to buy shopping centers, offices, and grow from there.
Like an evergreen fund that will continue
if you don't distribute the proceeds and you keep investing, it makes a lot of sense.
It's like tax-free investing, right?
Exactly.
It's tax-sheltered investing.
Exactly. Yes. You keep on investing.
Great. So just to wrap this up, maybe think about what are some of the one or two biggest mistakes that people come to you maybe too late, and things that you have to clean up in the real estate space that for people to watch out for as they're making their foray into this area.
Again, licensing. People, I've trusted a broker, I trusted the architects. They told me this, I went to the city hall and this is what I heard. So they took it for granted. That's one important thing. The other thing is to start with the wrong structure. I have these partners, we have all agreed to something, we didn't put it in writing, and now we have a problem.
I think that's everywhere.
That's everywhere. And there is one thing, I don't know how other jurisdictions work. Well, in Portugal, you can have a divorce, like everywhere else, almost everywhere else. In Portugal, if you have a 50-50 company, there's no way to overcome that problem. It's 50-50. You may be right, I may be right, I say yes, you say no, and we're stuck. So you need to have an agreement.
Have it well thought out.
How to overcome such a situation. Otherwise, you're stuck.
On the licensing part, is there any way to get sort of things written or before you purchase? Obviously, you can talk to the camera and get their indications, but a lot of times things change with time. Is there a process in which you can get a certain level of security about being able to develop what you want to develop before you purchase, or is there always going to be...
No, well, you can subject completion of the transaction to licensing.
To licensing.
It's quite common. I would say that once you have the architectural project approved, the risk is minimum because you've been through the whole process. There is something in the licensing that people sometimes don't understand. It's not just the city hall. There are many other entities in Portugal that need to give the opinion. And for some reason, sometimes they don't. And then environmental, or if it's an heritage, or sometimes it will depend on the location of the property. And you need to have outside opinions. Some of them are binding, some are not binding, and then the discussion starts around that. And sometimes the city hall doesn't ask for that opinion because it's up to the city hall to do it. We can do it directly, but the city hall typically do it. And sometimes there is something there that will be a stick in the process, like, you know.
So that would be another important consideration, having proper legal advice instead of just using a boilerplate CPCV. The fact that you can have the closing conditional on different aspects. So it's really important, almost more important than the actual sale document, that the CPCV is structured in a certain way.
If you're buying a property that is complete, that is already built, that's no-brainer. You know, it's quite simple. But if it's something that it's under construction, or it will be under construction, that is very, very, very important, I would say.
Thank you so much for your time today.
My pleasure. Thank you.